So welcome back to the second part of the Fujisan soap, and this is where we're actually going to use the scraped layers scrapers to make this soap. Now if you want to see that first video, click on the card that will appear on the screen right now. So this first layer here is our background layer, and it's this lovely white colour, and it's essentially representing the Japanese flag with a white background and a red sun. So obviously, to confuse things, I've used a blue background in my box up here. This box will basically build up with all the various layers. You'll see it as we go along. I have sped this video up a little bit as well, so it's going to go at quite a speed because this soap basically took about 5 or 6 hours to complete after scraping and waiting for each of those layers. So it's only about an hour's worth of work, but you have to wait for everything to set up. So what I'm doing here is just getting this layer ready. And I've made a dot on the top of my mould here. That's just to allow me to orientate the mould and the scrapers so they're always in the right orientation. So you'll see on the scrapers themselves, they have an R written on them. So moving on to our second layer, which is essentially going to be the fill of our first layer, we're going to use this beautiful red colour. Now, reds are notoriously difficult to get right in a cold process soap. And this particular red, I've used some alkanet root, and I've used some real red micas just to kind of get that colour. So you can see here what I'm doing is scraping off some of the layer and then going back in with the colour I've scraped off, filling in the areas that haven't scraped properly, and then scraping it back off again. Now this particular layer is a little bit soft at the moment, and I'm just going to wait for it to set up a little bit more to get those scrapes looking really, really nice and crisp and clean. And that's the key with a scraped layer soap, is you must just wait for the layers to set up. Now I didn't include that in the video because that's dull to watch, but what you'll see here is I'm taking that soap that I've just used and then I'm refilling in areas that need to be refilled so that the scrape looks really nice and crisp, and then going back in with my scraper. That's important to keep the scrapers orientated the right way. So I use my dot and then I write on the scrapers which way around they should be. So I'm getting this now into a position where I think it's absolutely fine, and it's going to work for me. But I'm going to go back in and just make sure those sides are working, make sure that everything's got those really nice crisp lines to it. And you'll see in the final soap that the time taken on that actually makes it far more beautiful, in my opinion, than kind of going with that, oh, that'll do. So scrape layers, you do need a bit of patience with them. I love doing them because I find them very therapeutic. But if you haven't got patience, maybe scrape layers are not for you. So as you can see here, what I'm doing is I'm just taking some of the soap that I've used from my little kind of storage vessel and laying it back into the side, and then scraping again, laying back in, scraping again, laying back in, scraping again, just waiting for this all to realistically just set up really nice and firmly for me. So what we'll do is we'll just kind of scrape off these bits and pieces here. And you'll see in the top here, you've seen this kind of red area. And that's really the area that I'm trying to get scraped out, so I can then fill that in with the red colour that I've just mixed up. So you'll see that I'm just kind of scraping that along and just making sure that the lines are nice and crisp and clear. When you have an area that kind of just ever so slightly cuts back in on itself, as you can see on the kind of right-hand side of the circle there, you actually have to go to the edge of the mould, scrape along, and then bring it back up in a vertical position so you're not losing that crispness of the line. So you'll go through and you'll just take bits off, and I'll show you a little bit how I kind of use different depths in order to get my scraped layers looking absolutely pristine. Now I do find that a palette knife is one of the best tools you can have for this, and to scrape off the excess batter that's sitting on both of the end layers, it just means that you're going to get a really nice end piece, and it does take some patience to get all of these lines working, but once I'm happy with it, I'm then going to pour my next layer colour, which is going to be a lovely kind of crisp, bright red colour. And as I say, I mix this using a number of different reds in order to get a really bright, true red, which is very difficult to achieve. And I'm still working on my true red colour. So if anyone has any tips or tricks for getting the perfect red colour, I'm all ears. Now you'll see that I've poured down a narrow spatula there, and it's really quite important to do that because what you want to be able to do is stop air bubbles in this essentially. Now on the left hand side here, you'll see I've got a diagram of how I'm doing these scrapes. So the first scrape, I only go in a little bit and I'm taking off some of the excess. Then what I'm going to do is drop in a little bit deeper. And when I make that next scrape, I'm taking off a little bit more of the soap. And then when I go for my next layer, I'm going to go in a little bit deeper again and take off some of that more soap. But by that point, I'm kind of getting to scraping layers beneath the one I want. So if I want to go and fill in with the colour that I'm using, and I've scraped off too much of the white underneath it, it's going to lighten that colour and it's going to change that colour. So what I want to try and do is on my scrapes is just take off enough of the red that I can save it to go back in. And here is my my little pot that I use in order to make my little mini personal soaps from this. And I always find that regardless of how cleverly you work out how much soap you need, you're always going to need to make more soap than required for each layer, and you're always going to have some leftovers. So this little mold here, I actually managed to fill all 6 of these layers up. Now, if you're using a bigger mold, the likelihood is you're still only going to fill those 6 layers up because you're making more soaps at any one time. But you do need to be mindful that you are going to use more soap batter per layer than you would in a normal soap. So all I'm doing is I'm taking off that layer by layer and filling in with my unwhitened red in the middle. And I'm just realistically trying to get this nice top shape. I'm then going to fill with snow colour. In order to get a really nice snow colour, you add a little bit of blue into it. So it'll be a white, a red, and then the top will be a little bit blue. So once I'm completely happy with my scrape, I'll then go in and I'll make my next colour. And again, I'm going to use my palette knife here to scrape off any of the bits along the sides and on the edges, just to make sure that I don't have any smears or anything nasty down the edges of the soap that I'd need to plane off a little bit later on, or if I do need to plane it, it's very minimal. So once this is all cleaned up, I'm going to use my next colour to fill in the top there. Now, I make each of my layers separately with separate amounts of oil and separate amounts of lye. I do master batch the lye for my particular recipe, and then I pull that off a little bit at a time to make my soap up with. I find that the best way of working. You may want to do it a different way. And then what I use is this is a little frappe mixer. And I've got to say thank you to the lovely I Dream in Soap for their recommendation of using a frappe mixer for doing this. It's a wonderful tool for doing small amounts of soap at a time. And you can bring it up to a really good trace with this. And again, here what you'll see is I've got it at a trace that is pourable, but it is going to thicken up relatively well. And in order to get the thickening action, I do add some coconut milk powder or some coconut cream powder. I also add some kaolin clay. Both of those will help your batter come to trace quicker. I don't have a lot of butters in this recipe. And again, butters will speed trace up. But in my opinion, I would much rather wait for my batter to come to trace naturally and to wait for it to get to the right consistency than to try and speed it up and have to plop it in and not really be able to work with it. And I know very, very well how long I've got to wait in order for my batter to get to the trace I want it to be at, rather than rushing and trying to think, oh my goodness me, how am I going to get this done? So I let this layer kind of set up a little bit. And what I did is kind of poured it over the red so that the red was no longer visible in my mold. So when it then comes to making the next scraped layer, I've got a lot more surface area covered and I'm scraping off less soap. So on my next layer here, I'm scraping off just a little white cap of Mount Fuji itself. So I'm going to go in with my scraper, and again, I'm going to take off little by little by little. And in order to differentiate this layer from the white sky layer, I just added the tiniest bit of blue to give it a kind of blueness. And actually, adding a little bit of blue to a white colour will actually make it seem whiter. It's the trick they use in washing powders in order to make your whites whiter, is they actually put a little bit of blue in there because it boosts the white colour. So it's a really good trick. If you want whiter than white, add a little blue. So again, what I'm doing is I'm scraping off. I'm saving a little bit of the white if I do need to go back in with anything. But as you can see, I'm scraping. I'm coming through to that red layer, and I'm essentially going to get a pink colour if I start mixing that up. So just be aware of those things when you're scraping it, and go back in, just take a little bit off at a time, a little bit off at a time, and a little bit off at a time. And then when we've gotten to that one, we're going to move on to our next layer, and it basically happens like that. So I'm going to leave you with a little bit of music now in order to see the rest of this soap take shape. I'll come back if there's anything interesting I want to let you know about. And in the meantime, enjoy the rest of this scraped layer soap. So you may have just noticed in the top of the screen here, my soap is now sitting on a little black mat that I've just pulled forward. This is a little heating mat. It was a very cheap heating mat from Amazon. I think it was less than £10. It's a USB one, so it doesn't get particularly hot. But what it does do is it allows the soap in the mould to basically come to trace a little bit quicker. I'm forcing gel a little bit through it, and I'm asking it to kind of firm up more. So if you want your soap, your batter, to firm up a little bit more so you can start scraping it, if you pop it on a little heating mat like this, it will allow your layers to firm up a little bit quicker, and it will allow you to scrape those layers quicker. As I say, I thoroughly enjoy the process of making these soaps, and I don't mind waiting because I go and do other things. But if you want to get through it a little bit quicker, a heating mat is well worth the investment. It doesn't need to be particularly big. And again, if you wanted to kind of use that mat to then force gel, you can leave the heating mat on, pop a cardboard box or something over the top of it, and allow that heat to kind of generate through the soap itself. Now, with the very intricate scrapers that I use and I make, you'll notice that I do need to go across this a number of times. I need to go back in and fill bits. I need to go back in and just make sure that everything is being filled, just to make sure that you're keeping the shape. And that's kind of quite important. And it's a necessary evil for doing scraped layers with, I'm afraid. If it's not your kind of thing and you prefer just to kind of get it in there and swirl some stuff around, don't do scraped layers. They'll bore you, you won't enjoy it, don't do it. But if you really like that kind of fine, finesse, beautiful kind of laciness to a design, scrape layers is a wonderful way of doing it. Now, in this one, and it was actually one of the entries I put in for the Soap Challenge Club competition, it required me to have a minimum of, I think it was either 5 or 6 scrapes, which meant I needed to have kind of 6 or 7 layers. So this is a particularly complex scraped soap because of the amount of layers in it. You do not have to go this complicated on scraped layers, and you don't have to go this fine and this fiddly with your layers. You are perfectly fine to have a zigzag shape and do layers like that. You can have a zigzag shape that creates a plaid pattern. You can use squares. You can use very simple shapes and simple scrapers to get some beautiful effects. It doesn't have to be this complicated, but I like to go big or go home. So I wanted something that had some complexity to it, that had some real detail to it. And I wanted it to be recognizable, regardless of who you were and where you lived, that you could say, yes, that looks like Mount Fuji. And I think I achieved that. I hope that you all agree. And this is where it kind of stemmed from. So again, this is just a little bit of a kind of insight into how I made the soap. I will do other scrape layers where I'll go a lot more slowly so you can see it. But as I say, this was hours upon hours upon hours of work. And for you to sit here and watch an hours and hours and hours of me waiting for a layer to set up is daft. So If you'd like to see some simpler scraped layers, which still give you a really beautiful effect, let me know in the comments below. So we're going to pour our first layer of tree line here. Now, the trees are a little bit, they're one of those things that I wanted it to look like trees, but I also wanted to have the feel that it was maybe kind of people. Because Mount Fuji is honoured so much by the local people, and it is such a treasured monument within the Japanese culture, I wanted the trees to also look a little bit like people as well. So however you see them is fine. But what I was going to say is if you're looking at creating the sensation of depth in layers rather than in depth itself, what you want to try and do is you want to try and start with your lightest colour as the furthest away item, and then you'll get darker as you come forward. So as my trees come forward and the ones that are closest to us, or the ones that I want to seem closest to us, they're going to be darker than the ones that are furthest away and therefore lighter. So you'll see as these trees go in, the lighter ones start further away. I'm going to scrape this next layer off here, and it's going to go into a mid green, and then the next green we put in will be a dark green. So you'll get that sense of it being further away or closer to you, depending on what colour you're using. And so what we're going to do here is we're just going to put our last colour green after we've scraped all these layers down. And again, just want to reiterate that it's really important that you understand the trace of your batter and when it's pourable and when it needs to be a little bit thicker or thinner. Because in these little narrow sections, if I hadn't got a really nice fluid batter and I got it too thick, it would never have sat into all these very fine grooves that I've made with my scraper. So in order to get all of those really nice fine grooves kind of sorted, you need to have a batter that's going to flow into them. It's going to sit down into them. I rarely try and bang my my moulds down because all these fine points would get lost if I'm banging it down. So what I want to try and do is allow gravity just to take that batter and allow it to flow into those grooves really naturally and really smoothly. Maybe a little shake so I'm not destroying any of those points and edges, but I just want it to kind of flow in there very, very nicely. So my last layer here, you can see it's a darker green again, and I think I even just pop a little bit more activated charcoal in there just to bring it down to almost a black green rather than it being a green. And then you can see here, as I pour it in, you'll notice that it's still relatively fluid. Now this may have been a little bit, this was probably just on the very, very cusp of it being a little bit too thick. And because it was a little bit too thick, I did need to actually just tap this on the table. Now I am tapping it very, very, very gently. It's only coming off about 1 inch. I'm just allowing it to kind of get into those grooves because I let this go too thick. Again, we're not all perfect. We don't do the perfect trace every single time. So it's worthwhile just kind of giving yourself a little bit of a break and saying, do you know what? Didn't do too badly on that one. I'm not going to stress over that. So you can see I'm tapping it down there and it was perfectly fine. And I had no air pockets within any of these layers. So again, working on your trace and knowing your trace is vital for when you work with layers like this. And so there's our final soap. Now, unfortunately, the cutting of this one did get lost in translation somewhere, so I don't have that one. But here you can see that soap and all the crisp lines in all of the layers, and I'm really, really pleased with that one. So if you've enjoyed this video, please give it a like. And if you haven't already, please subscribe to my channel. It really helps me grow and allows me to make more videos for all of you. When you subscribe, don't forget to click the bell icon to get notified when a new video is uploaded. And thanks a lot, Soapsters. We'll see you again next time.